All right, so today's book review is on the science of the art of psychotherapy. This is a book written by Dr. Allan Schore, who is a practicing clinical psychotherapist and has a PhD in psychology. And there are four main themes that resonate throughout all of Shore's work. He believes that the early stages of life are critical in all of the later developing structures and functions. Essentially, the beginning of things, how they start out, matters a lot. He also believes that any developmental theory must integrate both psychology and biology. The third principle in his work is that emotion is central to a deeper understanding of the human condition. And it's this emphasis on the right brain and its functions that's really the main idea of the book. And number four, unconscious processes lie at the core of understanding the self. And those four pillars are all part of a bigger paradigm shift that's happening right now in the world of psychotherapy, psychiatry, and neuroscience. And that's the shift away from an emphasis on the left brain in the world of cognition and a focus more on the right brain in the realm of emotion. That's what Shore's work is largely dedicated to in this book, trying to create a bridge between the psychoanalyst community and the neurobiology community. For a long time, these two disciplines were thought of as separate, or at least they didn't cross paths very often. But this book is a great compilation of work and research, and it's a case study on how our emotions play a major role in the way our brain develops. The difference between the right and the left hemispheres of the brain and the division of labor that happens between the two is really important to understand before we get into the rest of the book. And Schore does a really great job of laying out the differences between the two. The left brain controls established patterns of behavior, things that are known, information that doesn't change very often and is static. It likes to categorize things and it likes to put things into nice little boxes. The right brain, on the other hand, controls the bigger picture, and it deals in the processing of our emotions and novel information. It's interested in the nonverbal aspects of our communication, the unconscious, the subjective, and it deals with abstract thought and fluid information. There's a psychiatrist from England, his name is Ian McGilchrist, and he has this book called The Master and His Emissary, which is supposed to be an excellent book on this topic. I haven't read it yet, it's definitely on my list, but what I do know about the book is essentially there is a division between the right and the left hemisphere that he categorizes as a relationship between the master and the emissary. The right hemisphere is the master. It has the holistic view. It sees the big picture, and it knows that it needs to employ a subordinate in order to execute some of the more functional and administrative tasks that need to be carried out. And for that purpose, the right brain employs the left brain in the role of the emissary. The left brain thinks that it's in control because it's carrying out all the tasks and it thinks it's in the driver's seat. But meanwhile, the right brain is in the background pulling all the strings. So with all that in mind, that brings us to the main claim that Schore makes in his book. Self-organization of a developing brain occurs in the context of a relationship to another self, another brain. And that claim sets the stage for the majority of the research in the book because Schore places a lot of emphasis on the relationship between a mother and her child. He writes here, "It's the essential task in the first year for the infant to develop a secure and successful attachment with the mother." There's a relatively established consensus that's emerging in science right now that the origins of a lot of adult disease, especially psychological diseases, can be found among developmental and biological disruptions that occur earlier on in life. And the reason for that is because there's a major brain growth spurt that occurs in infants starting early on in utero in the third trimester, and it doesn't finish until about 24 months. The limbic system, the emotional processing center of the brain, myelinates during this period, developing mechanisms that allow for an increase in electrical transmissions in the brain. And when those early experiences of attachment and bonding are interrupted for too long, or they experience a lot of mixed signals, what can happen is it can lead to cognitive instabilities and underdevelopment of those brain centers that pop up later on in life as mental disorders. And this is different than Freud's theory that we're all probably more familiar with, where childhood trauma is kind of a disruption in an already regulated identity. This is a lot more fundamental. Before the age of 2, we don't have all of these regulating mechanisms that allow us to control our emotions and that interact with our autonomic nervous system. They're in the process of being formed, and Schore believes that they only form in a dyadic relationship with the mother pre and postpartum. The mother, in his theory, is like a psychobiological regulator, and the relationship that she develops with her child is ultimately going to structure the wiring of its right limbic system. And this is a really incredible, really terrifying, but also a very inspiring statement for women who have children and for women who are thinking about having kids. Mothers are the cornerstone for a child's development, and an infant may not be able to have a conversation with you yet, but 60% of our communication is nonverbal. And since a baby doesn't know how to speak yet, and it doesn't know how to communicate with you verbally, it's taking in all of these other signals of perception to try to understand the world. The tone of your voice, the tempo, the rhythm, the amplitude that you speak with, your body language, your facial expression, all of these are the vehicles with which secure attachments are made between mothers and their children. He also writes here, the idea that everything before birth is genetic and everything after birth is learned is a fallacy. Learning goes on in the fetus. The biological mother's emotional state influences the infant's developing brain. We know that the stress hormone cortisol crosses the placenta, so the emotional state of the mother has already begun to influence the child. And when I read that, I was like, wow, that is fascinating for all sorts of reasons. Every interaction is essentially a model that's going to shape how your child perceives and interacts with the outside world. And later on in the book, he takes a lot of his research and he uses it to share his opinions on how it should influence social and legal policies. I did have a problem with one of the statements that he made concerning divorce and 50-50 custody. Here's what he argues in the book. On the matter of primary caregiver, neuroscience indicates that pre- and postnatally, the mother's right brain is the key to this role. This is time sensitive as it is occurring in early critical periods. The idea of 50-50 custody splits in the first 2 years is, to my mind, highly problematic and will have negative long-term consequences. And the problem that I have taking that research and using it to inform custody policy is that you're completely leaving out the other side of the equation whenever we're talking about the child's development, and that is the role that the father plays in the brain development of the child. Later on in that chapter, he even talks about how underdeveloped the studies are on the relationship between the father and children and the role that fathers play in the cognitive development of infants. This area of study has been widely overlooked, if not suppressed, and we know from other aspects of scientific endeavor that resilience, for instance, is a function of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and successful development of those areas are largely promoted by rough and tumble play, which has been well documented in Jacques Paincep's work. It's one of these things where there's always trade-offs, and you have to be very careful when you're making legal policy, especially whenever you're making policy that has implications for such an intimate relationship like that of a parent and their child. You have to ensure that you're not going to make changes that are going to be counterproductive and harmful to the child. The well-being of the child should always be the guiding principle in these matters. And I think we have to be careful whenever we're looking at research and data to avoid putting too much emphasis on one aspect of a child's development at the expense of another. I also felt like this book could have been edited down quite a bit. I understand that it's a compilation of his work, but there were quite a few chapters that were really repetitive. And I've always had a problem with using jargon for the sake of using jargon. I definitely understand why in science, and especially in the realm of medicine, why there's such a need for precise terminology. In order to make progress and be effective, you have to get specific. And I especially understand in terms of treating patients how time sensitive those issues are and how using specific terminology can help you to diagnose and treat that patient more effectively and more efficiently. But there's also the reality that sometimes really smart people use really big words and complicated ways to get across really simple ideas. So here's an example. Stress-induced alterations in these dynamic psychobiological parameters mediate the therapist's somatic countertransference to the patient's nonverbal communications within a co-constructed intersubjective field. Come on, man. But with that being said, I really enjoyed the book. It was a great introduction to the field of psychiatry and psychotherapy. If you're interested in the field of psychology, Dr. Schore is definitely somebody whose work you should be familiar with. If you'd like to give it a read yourself, I've placed a link to the book down in the description where you can purchase it. Purchasing via the link helps support me, and it also helps me make more of these videos. And I'd love if everybody dropped a mom emoji down in the comments. Show love to all the mamas and the baby mamas. And also, I'm running my first half marathon this weekend at Sunset Beach here in North Carolina. I'm gonna be updating more information on that in my weekly newsletter, Sunday R&D. So if you're not signed up for that yet, you can click a link right here and you can sign up. This was my review of Science of the Art of Psychotherapy. Thank you for your attention. I'll see you in the next one.